Welcome to today's ClassLink webinar, where we will discuss making interoperability a reality, how open text standards are changing the way schools and publishers operate. Presenting today, we have from Pasco County Schools, Chris Jackson, Senior Manager of Technology and Information Services, Natalie Wanamaker, Business Analyst, and Barrett Karish, Server Support Analyst. From ClassLink, we have George Perrot, Chief Academic Officer, Patrick Devaney, VP of Interoperability Services, and our moderator for today's event, Gary Lamonaco, Director of Instructional Technology. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to review how attendees can ask questions and share thoughts to panelists during the webinar. Your webinar toolbar should have a questions section as you see here on the screen. Feel free to use it anytime during our interactive webinar. Important to note, this webinar is a high-level overview and discussion of interoperability, so if you do have specific technical questions, we can set up a call after the webinar ends. With that said, I will now turn this session over to our moderator for today's webinar. Gary, please take it away.
Thank you, Marla. Hi, everyone. My name is Gary Lamonaco, and I am the Director of Instructional Technology here at ClassLink. Today's discussion is going to be on interoperability. What is interoperability? Well, the definition is defined as the ability of computer systems or software to exchange and make use of information. As you can see from this illustration, the number of system programs being used in education today can get quite extensive. When these products don't communicate with each other, the users end up spending more time on manual processes like entering and recover passwords, building, submitting class rosters. This leads us to our focus for today's discussion around interoperability and how it can be achieved with your enrollment and sign-in progress. But before we actually engage with our panelists, I'd like to tell you a little bit about ClassLink and who we are. ClassLink's been around in the educational technology space for many years now, as you can see here. We're very excited to be celebrating our 20th year in educational technology. We've also been able to win many awards due to the innovation of our ClassLink platform, which also has allowed us to work with some great partners, as you can see below. But if you focus on the top of the screen, you're going to see some of the school districts that ClassLink is working with today. We are lucky enough to be speaking to one of these districts for our webinar, Pasco County. So with that, I would like to introduce Chris from Pasco County, and he can tell you a little bit about what his district looks like today. Chris?
Good afternoon. So Pasco County Schools is a school district just north of Tampa in Florida, and we are a large school district nationwide, but more of a medium-sized school district here in the state of Florida because many of the counties are very large, have very large student populations. But the basics of our county are we have about 80,000 students in about 90 schools, and we have about 12,000 staff members and about 50,000 computers on our network.
Great, thank you, Chris. So to begin our discussion, I'm going to introduce George Perrot, and he's going to kind of take us through the wild, wild west of educational technology. George?
Thanks, Gary. Again, my name is George Perrot, and I'm the Chief Academic Officer at ClassLink. I've been 40 years in Orange County Schools in Orlando, a little over twice the size of Pasco County. But having been in a school district and getting used to trying to access resources, we've sort of been through three methods of students and teachers being able to access digital curriculum. The first one is sort of what we call the Wild West, and that is when students and teachers have notebooks and file cards and all kinds of things available so that they can remember usernames and passwords, remember the websites that they have to go to, and it's just a big mess in terms of students and teachers having to remember all of the passwords and usernames and websites. So the next step that folks have sort of migrated to is the upgrade to what we call same sign-on. And the same sign-on is better than, let's say, a sharp stick in your eye. But same sign-on means that the user has one username and password, but each time they go to a different site, they have to go ahead and enter it each time they go. Now, that's better. They only have to remember one username and password, but it allows them to, they still have to log in each time. And then where we are today, especially with ClassLink, is single sign-on. And what that means is you sign in one time only, and from that point forward, you don't have to sign in again or remember any usernames and passwords. So you would have to determine where you are in this. And I think, Chris and Pasco, I think this is similar to your journey. Am I right?
It absolutely is. The basics are, we started with a scenario where we had tons and tons of digital resources available to our staff and students, but they all had to use different usernames and passwords to access those resources, as well as many times teachers in the schools would have to print out a huge list of these resources with the accompanying usernames and passwords, and then hand them out at periodic points throughout the school year so that the students would continue to have access to these resources. And then we migrated to a scenario where we tried to use the same sign-on with many of these applications, so that way we only had to list the individual applications and the URLs associated with them, but then only one username and password. And then ultimately we've migrated, and where we are today, for the most part, is that all of these applications utilize a single username and password, but from a more secured scenario using, in our case, ADFS to authenticate those applications. And the beauty about that, and one of the things I want to highlight, is the fact is from a security perspective, it's a lot more preferable than the second piece, which is same sign-on, because we're not actually uploading or sending these usernames and passwords inside our data files up to these vendors. And so now we can control those passwords, and if those vendor scenarios were to be compromised, our usernames and passwords wouldn't be sitting out there on the internet in these databases. So it's pretty good.
That's an important note there. When we talk about interoperability around single sign-on, you'll take a look here. ClassLink recognizes, or ClassLink utilizes, the most wide variety of authorization technologies that are available. So you can see here, this means a lot to those of you who are technical. If you're instructional, this is sort of the alphabet soup of technological methodologies. We typically try and encourage our third-party vendors to adopt either OAuth or LTI. Those do not require the transmission of usernames and passwords. So again, much more secure. But you can see that we also support Google and O365, ADFS, SAML, including Shibboleth and CAS. So what happens is now we have a way to connect to these third-party vendors using only the district-provided federated identity as their sign-on. So the important thing here is these are all industry standard types authorization technologies. There are some folks out there who only support perhaps one type of auth method. Sometimes a district will say you have to use ADFS. We just don't think that that's the best way to go, because a lot of third-party vendors have different methodologies. So we feel like it's important for us to be able to support multiple authorization protocols. And again, with LTI and OAuth, it's more of an authorization than it is an authentication, and I think that's an important distinction.
Great, thank you, George. So let's talk about Rollout and how you get this set up in your environment, what it feels like, and what it is to go through a ClassLink Rollout. So Chris, tell us a little bit about your story and how you took this on in Pasco County.
Well, I'm going to let Natalie take that question. So Natalie.
Sure.
So the rollout in Pasco County was pretty good, honestly. The first thing we did was we branded ClassLink for our county. So we branded it to be My Pasco Connect. Perrot and myself, along with Chris, worked with the vendors to disable the backdoor method and make sure that we were utilizing My Pasco Connect to access all the resources. The third bullet that says collaborative with content area specialist. So Perrot and I spent a lot of time working with the curriculum department, making sure that we had all of the information we needed to make sure we were passing the correct information to the vendors. And then as far as providing training, we have a PD week over the summer, the learning symposium, And we also assisted with the new teacher orientation. Anything else you think of? The learning design coaches and RMAs. So the RMAs and learning design coaches, we used to have technology specialists and media specialists in the schools, but those have gone away, and we have a new coach called a learning design coach. And we used to have media tech assistants, but now they're called resource management associates. So those two are our key players at the schools to help us support the rollout of My Pasco Connect.
Great. Great. Thank you, Natalie. Appreciate that. So as you can see, Pasco has definitely benefited for single sign-on. And with that, I'd like to introduce Patrick, part of our interoperability team, and he's going to discuss SSO benefits. Go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Gary. And I'm going to call on Pasco to join in a little bit here. I think ultimately, when we talk about single sign-on, one of the biggest benefits that everybody sees right away is the simplicity of it and the thought that it's going to be easier for users, both students and teachers. Goes directly to our mantra, which is more time learning, less time logging on. But I think that there are some other benefits there, and I'd like to ask Pasco to comment on some other areas where the single sign-on environment has helped, has benefited them. Any contributions you can share there?
Sure. I mean, I'll echo what I said earlier. About security. I mean, I see one of the bullet items is security, secure. Another piece of the puzzle that we found was helpful as we moved to single sign-on was, support calls and support tickets that we got at our help desk. Those numbers went down specifically because now we didn't have to worry about, a smorgasbord of usernames and passwords that we had to deal with and what vendor they were. And now we're talking about a single username, single password that could get you access to all of those applications. And as such, that part of the troubleshooting was much less.
Great. Can I suggest a couple other, and you can validate them or not? One of the things that we hear often is the administration of users and which accounts they can get access to is easier because from an administrative perspective, you can assign access and kind of in bulk create this single sign-on environment for them without having to do it in a more manual fashion. And also access to analytical data. I think both of those are made available through the single sign-on platform that ClassLink offers you. Is that true?
Agreed. Specifically, the second case is much, as we said, during our rollout, one of the goals that we have is to try to end what we consider backdoors or alternate methods to log into these applications. Because one of the things that we want to be able to do with the ClassLink dashboard, the analytics piece of it, is to try to tie into what these vendors are telling us that the utilization is of their application versus what we really believe it to be. And so now we have that piece of puzzle, because in our history in the past, what we found was that vendors would say that we were using this particular application a lot, but yet when we queried our staff and students and when we looked at network data, that didn't actually correlate. So one of the nice things is now we can see, using the analytics in the ClassLink portal, that basically whether or not we agree or we don't agree, and we've done that by, again, closing the back doors and forcing the application logging in, or the access to that application via the dashboard. So now we have all of the clicks and all of the accesses there.
Yeah, and Chris, I think one of the things that's important there that you've mentioned a couple of times is closing those back doors. I know that when I first did this implementation, when I was a customer, one of the first things I had to do was take away the ability of our learning resource teachers to manually add students into the mix, because what happens then is that a student then has multiple identities. The student data doesn't correlate. And then when they move from school to school, they oftentimes will get yet another identity. And so I wasn't very popular at that very moment to take away that ability. And typically my response is, and we'll get to the rostering piece in just a minute or two, but if we get the schedule correct in the student information system, then the student will have access that they need. So I think that's an important thing as people think about rolling out a single sign-on platform, is taking away those back doors, as you called them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I think we could take that one step further. You also are able to better control and vet the applications that you want users to gain access to. So if they are proven as effective for you in your environment, you can make sure everybody has access to them. And if there's something that you don't want them to do, you can prevent them from rolling that out or logging in through the single sign-on platform. I think there's one that we didn't even mention here, which is probably the most obvious, and that is that all the little notes, post-its with usernames and passwords that often we rely on to remember those usernames and passwords in the past, those are gone. So the security of who's actually logging in is much tighter. It's a much more safer environment in that regard. I'd like to follow up a little bit more with the economic benefit of doing this. Chris or Natalie, anyone, did you do single sign-on in the past with one-to-one, where you would use a standard to set up a one-to-one connection to a vendor? Have you done that in the past?
No, not typically. So yeah, when we rolled out, our my Pasco Connector, our ClassLink portal, that kind of went hand in hand with our integration with many of the vendors, using, like I said earlier, ADFS, but we could have been using any one of the alphabet soups, as George called it, of authentication protocols.
Great. Well, I'll summarize it in a couple. You were able to kind of jump step. Sometimes districts will start by doing one-to-one kind of single sign-on connections using the benefit of the standard for the integration. And with the introduction of ClassLink in this environment, you're able to kind of jumpstart that and have your users log in once, and they're able to integrate lots of different vendors at the same time and have a seamless application for all of those users across all those different authentication methods. So those are some of the real strong benefits, I believe. Unless anybody has any others they'd like to contribute, I think we probably are
Patrick,
ready.
Patrick, let me just say there under the first bullet there under Streamline, at the end of the day, while we may have technical people and instructional people on the line, this technology is really not about the technology. This is about lost instructional time and teacher and student and parent frustration. At the end of the day, we can talk about all of the wires and switches and authentication protocols and the whole alphabet soup. But at the end of the day, we have to remember this is about our customers, and this is about students and teachers and their frustration and the amount of time that gets lost in a classroom trying to get kids logged in and out of websites such that eventually people just give up because it just is too onerous to be able to do that. And as I've often said, I've never seen a school district mission or vision that doesn't talk about student achievement. And I think that's an important part here, that we're supporting essentially every district's vision and mission.
Couldn't agree more, George. Couldn't agree more. You want to move into talking about rostering next?
Exactly. This is my very favorite topic. So now I want to talk about rostering, and it means a little something different to each person. But I want to address this because having been victimized by various publishing houses around getting students into these systems, we have come up with a way to sort of standardize this. So rostering takes two sort of forms. One is the process of creating a user accounts. So in other words, they may just need an account to get into a platform to be able to log in, whatever it may be. Let's just say maybe it's something like BrainPop or Encyclopedia Britannica or some digital resource that's out there where they need a credential in order to access it. But more importantly, this is what I call the second head of the two-headed dragon. I can get you into the platform via single sign-on, but those poor teachers on the other end, what they want is to be able to click, to be logged in, and to see their students already rostered in the class so that they can begin to effectively utilize that digital platform. Typically what's happened is we've had folks who are
teachers creating spreadsheets and emailing them to the company. We've had situations where teachers have to go and look at the student body and pick students and drag them over. We've had them having to do manual entry of students and designate usernames and passwords. So, I mean, these are all things that cause digital platforms just to fail. So this is the typical roster reality. And even if we do upload these things, so if we want to send this so that the teachers don't have to do all that, typically the publishers have custom extracts that they need from the student information system. And sometimes the same company has two different platforms and two different file formats. And what this does is it essentially causes people in IT in particular who have to do these extracts to just lose their mind, because every different company has a different file format. And then the whole idea of managing all of the updates, and coming from a very, very large district, I had a delta of about 500 changes a day. Now, there's just hardly any way to keep up with that. Now, I'm from a very large district, but I'm guessing, Chris, you all had similar frustrations.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I love the way you portrayed that. I think we feel the same way about being victimized many times, or it feels that way. You know, I have a different two-headed dragon scenario that I always call this. It's like a continuum of digital resources. And on one end, you have this great digital resource that's amazing instructionally, but the technology fails. Maybe because we didn't have it doesn't support a rostering scenario, or you had some kind of element where it didn't work on this platform. And then on the opposite end of that spectrum, you have something that's amazing technically, super easy to integrate into single sign-on. It's amazing from a perspective of how we're going to get it rostered, but the problem is that it doesn't work instructionally. So you have to meet somewhere in the middle, I think, from that two-headed dragon, and say we got to find a product that can do these things, and so that there are a set of products out there that fit those criteria, and we can start to get people to use these things, because that ultimately, like I said earlier, is the goal: get people to use these for instruction and not have to worry about logging in or worrying about exporting CSV files from your SIS and importing it into this vendor so that you can get the students accessing it and any of that stuff.
Yeah, and I appreciate it, and forgive the technical jargon that's getting ready to come at you. But what I had when I was forced to do this because the IT department was too busy, they were doing an export out of the student information system, running it through an ETL that went into a data warehouse. That data warehouse generated a set of SQL tables that I had an ODBC connection to, that I accessed via Access, converted to Excel, moved the columns, concatenated fields, and then I used FileZilla to send it off to the publisher. So, not being somebody who knows how to script things, that was my process for getting my students uploaded. And it was very onerous, obviously, to make that happen. And I tried to do it once a week, but sometimes I had complete control of my schedule till about 7:30 in the morning. So these updates, these changes, the hoops that you have to jump through, especially somebody like me who doesn't code, became what it is a barrier to students and teachers getting access. So I think that those are important points to know. So Chris, I think this is you.
Okay. So one of the things that we want to talk about is what did this take to kind of get off the ground, and kind of what do we see from a support perspective? So obviously, we said before, we're a large district, 80,000 students. We got a lot of people using these things. We support this really. We have a small help desk. We have 3 people on the help desk. They're manned from, let's say, 8 o'clock in the morning to 4:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and we handle all the calls from all the employees, students, parents, the whole gamut. And then the 3 folks of us that are on the call, and really less so me, but more so Natalie and Barrett, support this application completely amongst themselves. And it is not their major portion of their job. In fact, it's actually a small part of their job. And that's one of the things that we were so happy with when we went this direction and started getting these things in place, is that it helped us so much in how we provide technical support, getting that technical support immediately, because you can't have students sitting there not being able to use applications for days at a time. Instruction time is being lost.
Correct. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is we're going to take a deeper dive into OneRoster, and George is going to talk to you a little bit about how it came about and what it's really involved in rostering. Go ahead, George.
Thanks, Gary. This is my favorite topic, and I can only talk about it for about 3 hours at a time. Prior to my joining ClassLink, when I was with Orange County Schools, I was a member of the IMS Global K-12 Advisory Board. And if you're not familiar with IMS Global, they are a standards organization, and they have lots of other standards beyond just rostering. But if you're familiar with LTI or QTI, APIP, these are all IMS Global. The common cartridge, the thin common cartridge, these are all IMS Global standards. So while in Orange, I approached the CEO of IMS Global and said, this is an issue for every district in the country, and the size of the district is irrelevant. Whether it's 2,000 or 200,000, we all struggle with this. So we need to come up with a standard. So what happened is, through IMS Global, OneRoster was born. And so OneRoster is a standard by IMS Global that allows us to create a single set of files that multiple users will accept. We have found that in most cases, IT departments don't mind generating a single set of files if they only have to do it once. It's the continual custom extracts that drive people crazy. So this is an open data standard. Okay, this is not proprietary. You can access the data either through CSV or REST API. It's been around since 2015, and there isn't anybody can write to the standard, and so the standard from IMS Global is something that ClassLink subscribes to. So we have a certified tool that generates these files, and you can see here there are a number of companies who are involved with IMS Global and school districts. So this standard was developed with input from the vendors and from school districts. And I would encourage, if your district is not a member of IMS Global, that you consider joining at some level.
Thank you, George. So to this point, we've talked about the benefits of single sign-on, and now we're going to talk about the benefits of rostering. So with that, I'd like to bring Patrick back into the conversation.
Oh, okay. I thought we were going to, there's a list there of those. Yeah, back up one, Gary. Back up. All right.
Sorry, George, go ahead.
So this is a list of some of the leading adopters of OneRoster. So in other words, if you generate the OneRoster file set, and it's not a flat file, it's about 7 or 8 files, but these are some of the major adopters who are accepting that file format. And this list has grown significantly over the last few years. In fact, I've not seen a standard get this much traction this quickly in all of my 40 years. And Patrick, I think that, in your role as VP of Interoperability, I think that you've had quite a bit of discussion with a number of these companies, have you not?
Absolutely. And you notice there's a link at the top of the page here. This shows this portal.classlink.com/vendors. That reflects the audience of vendors that we have worked with OneRoster files, have worked with successfully. I would concur, George, and I have both time here in the ed tech space as well as time in the telecommunication space. Standards aren't things that necessarily gain traction quickly, and I'm incredibly impressed with the traction that OneRoster has gotten and the almost universal acceptance that it is the rostering standard today among educators, among educational applications. You also, one other point that I would notice, and I would note, and this goes back to George's comment that it's an open standard and anybody can build to it. On that list, you'll see some vendors have, in fact, an asterisk next to their name. They have gone through the process of getting certified, but there are others on there that do not have the asterisk next to their name, but they have written and adopted the standard. So it's important to note as you go down this journey that you ask the question: are you compatible? Are you certified? Can you use the one roster data? Is probably more pertinent than are you certified necessarily. Okay. George, are you going to talk about our structure here? Or?
Well, I can, and then happy for you to wade in. But
Sure.
The way that this works now is we provide a roster server that takes files from your SIS and formats them in the one roster file format, and then sends them out to all of the various publishers. Now, again, it has a built-in FTP client. You can either send CSVs, or the vendor can fetch the files via REST API, which is the preferable method. The thing I want to talk about here is the fact that it's one set of files, and number two, this roster server that we have, Patrick alluded to earlier, you have compliant and you have certified. So as contributing members of IMS Global, our roster server is certified by IMS Global. What that means is if you are dealing with a vendor who is also certified, then this becomes a relatively seamless process in terms of getting that roster information to the vendors. Again, and this is an open standard. It is not a ClassLink standard. We don't think that it's right to have proprietary formats to do this, and we don't charge any vendors any fees to receive files from our roster server. We don't think that that's a model that is sustainable. Patrick, you want to add to that?
I would absolutely concur with what you've said, and I think in terms of the way this flows, there's a couple of pieces that we would want to add. The roster server is controlled by the district, so they are able to add or remove the applications that they want to roster to. Information is brought in from the student information system on a scheduled and regular basis, and that allows for the information to be either pushed or retrieved by the application vendor, depending on which approach they want to use, also on a regular basis. So not only can this be used to set up the initial rosters in all of the applications, it also operates in a fashion that it's near real-time updates all throughout the year. So if a student is added, the information is pushed to the roster server and then made available to the application. All that happens within about a 24-hour period. So it's a wonderful tool for setting up as well as maintaining accurate information in those vendor platforms.
And what you said, I think, is very important. ClassLink does not consume your district student data. This is your server. That server can be housed either behind your firewall, or it can be or we can host it for you in the cloud. But the bottom line is we don't take that. We don't commingle your data. We don't hold your information in a large database up in the cloud. So it's very, very secure. In fact, just recently we've been certified by iKeepSafe for our security protocols.
In addition to complying with the federal and state privacy requirements in almost all states, if not all states, that we're aware of. Any other comments on this before we kind of summarize? Let's move on then.
Chris,
Go ahead.
Chris, has this made? I know you all were early adopters of the roster server. How has this impacted your ability to get students rostered into classes in a timely manner?
I'm going to point that to Perrot to speak to that, because he's the one that wrote most of these interfaces previously, and then realized a lot of the time savings when he moved to a single file elements. So, Barrett? Tell them about how you kind of time savings and how you realize.
Yes, sorry about that. So yeah, so utilizing ClassLink's roster server, we were able to cut down a lot of the vendor file pulls. I mean, we eliminated about 12 different file pulls that we were doing and combined it all into one with one roster and the roster server. And one of the great benefits of the roster server as well is now it's just a few clicks to add or remove schools and courses for permissions for that vendor instead of modifying SQL code and modifying the code and checking to make sure it still works, checking the resulting file and then sending it up. You can guarantee that it'll be, exactly what you're looking for with a point and click interface.
All right, thanks, Barrett. Yeah, those are the basics of, we realize, I think that to us has been one of the biggest pieces from a help perspective outside of, removing and from a single sign-on perspective, moving everyone to a one username, one password, was the fact that now when we talk about rostering, we can get, the big thing is as students move around, we have one of the things about our county is we have a high migrant population. We have a lot of farm elements in some of our areas and some of our more rural areas in our county. And as such, students move around a lot. And previously, this, even with respect to rostering and this, the roster server, now this has kind of become really not even a thought anymore, And so, and if the vendor needs a new data element, or we need to remove a data element from a vendor, it's much more simple to do that today than having to go back and change the SQL queries. And I can't even imagine, George, what you used to do when you were talking about all those steps. I mean, I understand all those steps. And I laughed when you said that because I just totally I saw myself doing that for years. And now, that we don't have to worry about that. That workload has been streamlined completely.
Well, tell me now also, and maybe this is to Natalie, but now that you start doing solicitation with vendors, what has been the response to, requiring or talking to them about one roster from the vendor perspective?
I mean, I would say at the beginning when we first rolled it out, it was a struggle. I used a scare tactic email that went over very well with our third floor. But now it's the majority of the vendors, like I saw Quaver on your list. They're a new vendor for us. They're very receptive to it, and they understand that if they don't comply to our needs, we're not going to work with them. So it's been super successful so far, knock on wood.
So you all have put a stake in the ground around this, is that right?
Yes, absolutely. On the tech side, and if it's a digital resource that curriculum chooses to use and it doesn't work on the tech side, it's just not something that's going to be available in single sign-on, which they don't want. So it's worked.
Do you find that vendors coming in now are aware of one roster?
Yes. I would say definitely yes. In comparison, again, to when we started, it's almost like it was news to them, even though it shouldn't have been. And now it's common knowledge, even for vendors that we thought were small, were ready to jump on board.
Okay, so the adoption has been, would you agree with what I said earlier insofar as the rate of adoption of this particular standard has been pretty quick?
Oh yes, absolutely, yes.
All right.
So
sorry, Patrick, didn't mean to hijack that.
No worries at all. That was valuable conversation, and I think it's done a good job to kind of feed up to what we want to do here, which is talk a little bit about. We want to summarize the benefits of using these interoperability standards, specifically as they pertain to implementing a ClassLink roster server. And one of the first themes is around streamlining and ease of use. And I think it's clearly been identified that it's easier for the district, for the customer to roster this way. But we also, and in my work with vendors across the space, get comments all the time that the vendors are actually saving money and time and energy as well So hopefully that will come back in some fashion, either through new product development or price reductions, additional services for districts over time. I think we identified that it's good for not just the initial setup, but it's good to maintain the accuracy. And as Chris had mentioned, they have a migrant population that comes and goes, and now all of a sudden it's not an issue. Or George, for you, those 500 changes every day in the rosters are really handled kind of automatically in the process as it runs and as it works through. In addition, there's a point that we didn't bring up that's something that we should probably mention, and that is that resources can also be assigned to students. Not only is their account in the platform created, but they also can have associated resources assigned to them. So let's say you have a student that's in an algebra class, or maybe a history class is a better example, and there's a book that goes along with the history class that's in digital format. That can also be assigned, or access to that can be assigned to those students. And then I'd like to, in terms of streamlining, or ease of implementation, I'd like to add one more kind of part to this conversation. And that is, it may seem overwhelming to think about this and, oh, this is such a big job, this is so much work, we're so far from being able to do it. But I think that you have a partner here in ClassLink, and we have a lot of tools that we can use to, number one, condition the data to make it simpler to get it up and going. But I'd like to ask Pasco to comment on your experience in working with us, and how challenging was it, or how challenging did it appear on the front end, and once you're on the other side, how has it gone?
It was actually a very easy process. I mean, like it was said before, it was just a server that can either be on premises in your data center or hosted in the cloud. We virtualized our server on premises. The setup was done in under an hour by ClassLink. So, no partner for us to get that set up. It's a super easy to use web interface. Point and click, get things done. ClassLink was great in helping us get our OneRoster files validated and imported into the OneRoster server when we initially got it set up. They helped me fix some errors that we had with the import. And they also walked me through adding apps for the vendors and making sure that the data was assigned properly and that it actually got to the vendor either through the REST API or through CSV files uploaded through SFTP.
Great. Well, and I somebody was going to say something.
I was going to add something too. This is Chris talking. So I was going to add, from a streamlining perspective, one of the things that I see from a management perspective is that we were able to, before we would spend a lot of effort, writing these SQL queries or writing these programs to extract this data for all these different vendors. We had all these files. One of the things I've seen since is now what I've been able to do is take some of the time we were saving from that effort and start to think about other things. And one of the things that we've been focusing on recently is that what data are we sending these vendors? And so many times a vendor will say they'll have this entire list of all these fields that they want, right? So, but if they're OneRoster compliant, we have that set of fields, and that's fine. But the second piece of this question is, should that vendor get that data? And so what we've seen is that many times some pieces of data wasn't necessary to be being sent to this vendor. But because we were spending so much time trying to create these files, we didn't have enough time to think about that piece. And so I brought that recently up, and so that's one of the things we've been spending a major effort on is, if just because a vendor says they need, let's just, for example, say they want primary exceptionality, well, we're now asking ourselves, because we have time to do this, why do they need primary exceptionality? I mean, if we're talking about getting access to Algebra Nation, they don't need primary exceptionality. That's to us a secured field, and there's no necessary element to send that up because they don't have any reporting elements inside their application that ties back student achievement to those pieces of data. So what we're doing is becoming much more secure in what data we're sharing with vendors as well.
Chris, that's an excellent point. And as the custodian of this data, how often do you get the chance to really act like the custodian instead of acting like the search and rescue or just trying to keep up.
Yeah.
I think it's a fantastic point, and one that's further reinforced from a security perspective by some of the comments we made about this being your dedicated server. You control who accesses it. It's never commingled with anybody else. And all of the transmissions, regardless of the format, whether they're CSV or API calls, those are all encrypted as well. So it creates a much more secure environment, one where the district has much more control over what and how the information is shared. Any other comments on security? Great. Then finally, and I think you kind of alluded to this a little bit as well in the process, but there are savings here with regards to how many district resources are required to facilitate the rostering function. But I think that there's another savings as well, and that is if you weren't getting this work done until October or November, or a new student comes in and they're not enrolled for 2 weeks because of the workload that's required to make it happen, by making them available immediately when school starts, by making them resources available to new students immediately, you're actually saving money, and you're allowing the use of the resources for a longer period of time. I might classify that as economic. You could classify it as maybe something else, but I believe you're getting benefits that are beyond just the accessing. And finally, this is part of the suite of services that we offer. So we're offering this to you at no incremental cost, so that there's some real economic advantages. How much time would you say, not that I put Pasco on the spot, I wouldn't say how much time have you saved in resources, but maybe have you been able to take on more projects, or have you been able to invest more time in projects that you have based upon those freed up resources?
Well, yeah, I mean, I alluded to one earlier when we were talking about streamlining. This is kind of a piece, and they're all part and parcel. You can spend more time looking at security. So, one of the things is now we're not spending so much time writing SQL queries. We're having opportunities to take a look at what data are we sending and actually asking those questions. But I want to share Pasco's story with respect to what your point you just made a minute ago, which is, how quickly now can we get students and teachers started in these applications at the beginning of the year? Prior to us utilizing, the one roster standard, our rostering server, let's just say 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, processes, you're absolutely correct. In our situation, folks weren't getting access to these applications and digital resources until October and November. You're absolutely correct, and that we echo that in our own county. And at this point, for example, for the start of this particular school year, those resources were available to staff the day that staff returned. And in our county, staff returns 1 week before school starts. So teachers, actually, they had it before that, but the point is that this was the first year of any year ever that teachers had access to all those digital resources, and the rostering was there and ready to go for them at the start of school, and that was unheard of in our county. And I'm confident that most counties are in that same boat.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And that's something we like to call digital day one, right? Student comes in, sits down, logs in, they're ready to go. And that's really what we're focusing on here. So I know we're almost at the end of our webinar, but we do have a few questions that I'd like to review. So Patrick and George, I'm going to go ahead and open up these questions, and feel free to answer. So first question, does ClassLink auto update when pupils change class groups?
Yeah, we've just talked about this, and basically what happens is the rostering information is updated every day, and the vendors can then reflect those changes. So it's a near real time. It doesn't happen instantly, but within a day, when new students come in or students leave, those changes the information is presented to the vendors for them to actually reflect that in the accounts that are available.
Great.
Yeah, it depends on how often you schedule those updates too.
Yep.
Okay. The second question that we have here is, what are you doing with those apps that are not OneRoster compliant? How do you provision those records?
That's a great question. And here's what I would say is if they're not OneRoster compliant, then you're back to where you, in all honesty, you're back to where you are now, and that is creating those custom extracts. What I would say to that is, you may not be able to jettison some of those folks now because people love it and what have you, but I would say that requires you to have a conversation with that vendor to say that moving forward, this is going to be a requirement. This comes down to sort of leadership and not being victimized, as using the term I used earlier, with this. Now, in my role, I just put a stake in the ground, and you heard Natalie say that that's a requirement for doing business now. And we talked to a great many districts who are in transition. They're saying, okay, we're going to use you now, but moving forward, if you don't comply with this standard, then you're not going to be invited to our party anymore.
And I would also share that ClassLink can be a great partner in this effort. We can, number one, connect you with districts that do have successful policies or strategies in place to work with vendors and to bring them on. It's not an absolute, you do it today or you're done. In many cases, they have kind of a progressional strategy in place. But also, reach out to me, let me know, and I can work with you. So by talking to vendors from both the consumer side of things, we need to have this, and from the partner side of things, ClassLink can help you do it. A lot of times we've been able to bring vendors along even quicker and really get their buy-in much sooner in the process.
Well, especially since we don't charge any of those vendors to help them figure this out.
Right.
Awesome.
Same way we give unlimited support to customers, we give unlimited support to the vendor partners that we work with as well.
Correct. Well, thank you, Patrick. Thank you, George. So I know that there was a few more questions that were asked in the chat. They're a little more technical. So what we'll do is we'll have the representatives reach out to you directly, and they can get a little bit deeper into those questions and answer them for you. But before we end, I would like to summarize what we went over today about making interoperability happen. And obviously, here's some pointers here. So you want to look at your vision, make sure your vision is in place. Once you do that, go and gather all the digital resources that you're going to want to be able to access through the ClassLink platform. Then you're going to want to look into some IMS global information, see who you're working with, are they certified? If not, can they get to that point, and how they can help you out. And of course, like Natalie mentioned, define this language in your RFPs. It's going to help you get those vendors on board. And of course, work with ClassLink to help support your goals, and of course, achieve your dream there with single sign-on and complete interoperability. So before we end, though, I'd like to ask Pasco if there's anything else they'd like to add to that list or anything they'd like to say in closing.
No,
Natalie,
thank you for the opportunity.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you, Pasco. We truly appreciate you taking the time to talk about your story today, and I hope everybody got a lot of great information out of this discussion. Marla?
Yes, so as Gary mentioned, and thanks for the shameless plug for ClassLink, but I do want to say next steps. So if you're interested or you have follow-up questions, we will definitely reach out, but at any time you can always contact us as well. We're happy to answer the phone and get on the phone and dive into deeper technical questions. Additional resources are on the screen. And then I just want to thank everyone on behalf of ClassLink. Thank all of today's attendees for joining us. We look forward to many more interactive webinars together. And I'd also love to thank our panelists for being online with us today to share their insights on this incredibly relevant topic. If you do have any specific questions to our panelists, feel free to contact them at the email addresses provided on this screen. And again, if you would like more information about ClassLink, please visit us on the web at www.classlink.com. And feel free to connect with us on Twitter at ClassLink to keep up with news and updates. Thank you once again for your participation in our ClassLink Leadership webinar, and have a great day.